Section 23 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 11. The Church and Education, Part 2. The great Benedictine monastery of black monks was situated at Westminster, away from the city, as was usual. This was the only monastic house subject to the rule of St. Benedict in the neighbourhood of London, but the houses of nuns, of which there were many dotted over the suburbs of London, were governed by the rule of St. Benedict. Among these may be mentioned the nunneries of Barking, Clerkenwell, Halliwell at the eastern extremity of Finsbury Fields, St. Helens, Bishopsgate, Kilburn, and Stratford at Bow. As time proceeded, there was a widespread desire for a stricter rule among the monks, and reforms of the Benedictine rule were instituted at Cluny, AD 910, Chartreux, about 1080, and Citeaux, 1098. All these reforms were represented in London. Cluniac Order. This reform was begun by Bernan, Abbot of Guigny in Burgundy, and perfected by Odo, Abbot of Cluny. The first charter of the order was dated AD 910. The order was first brought to England by William, Earl of Warren, son-in-law to William the Conqueror, who built the first house at Lewes in Sussex about 1077. The Priory of Bermondsey in Surrey was founded by Aylwin Child, citizen of London, about 1082. The manor of Bermondsey and other revenues were granted by William Rufus. The original priories were subject to the heads of the parent foreign houses, but John Attleborough, prior of Bermondsey, having procured the erection of his priory into an abbacy, himself became the first of the abbots in 1399. If we are to believe the word of the satirists, we may judge that the rule of the Cluniac order was hard, for we are told that, quote, "When you wish to sleep, they awake you," end quote, and quote, "When you wish to eat, they make you fast," end quote. There were cells attached to the Cluniac house of Bermondsey at Aldersgate, Cripplegate, and Holborn. Carthusians. Bruno first instituted the order at Chartreux in the Diocese of Grenoble in France about 1080. The rule was confirmed by Pope Alexander III about 1174. This was the most strict of any of the religious orders. The monks never ate flesh, and were obliged to fast on bread, water, and salt one day in every week. No one was permitted to go out of the bounds of the monastery except the priors and procurators or proctors, and they only upon the necessary affairs of their houses. When the order was brought to England in 1178, the first house was started at Witham in Somersetshire. In all, there were 9 houses of the order in England. One of these was the Charterhouse of London, which was not founded until 1371 by Sir Walter Manny, Knight of the Garter. Until Henry II founded the Carthusian house at Witham, it is said that there was no such thing known in England as a monk's cell, as we understand the term. It was a peculiarity of the Carthusian order, and when it was first introduced it was regarded as a startling novelty for any privacy or anything approaching solitude to be tolerated in a monastery. The Carthusian system never found much favour in England. Cistercians. The Cistercian order was named after Cistertium or Citeaux, in the bishopric of Chalon in Burgundy, where it was founded in 1098 by Robert, Abbot of Molesme, in that province. St. Bernard was a great promoter of the order, and founded an abbey at Clairvaux about 1116, and after him the members of the order were sometimes named Bernardines. It was usual to plant these monasteries in solitary and uncultivated places, and no other house, even of their own order, was allowed to be built within a certain distance of the original establishment. This makes it surprising to learn that there were 2 separate houses of this order in the near neighbourhood of London. A branch of the order came to England about 1128, and their first house was founded at Waverley in Surrey. Very shortly after, about 1134, the Abbey of Stratford-Langthorne in Essex was founded by William de Montfichet, who endowed it with all his lordship in West Ham. It was not until 2 centuries afterwards that the second Cistercian house in the immediate neighbourhood of London was founded. This was the Abbey of St Mary Graces, Eastminster or New Abbey, without the walls of London, which Edward III instituted in 1350 after a severe scourge of plague, the so-called Black Death. The 2 great military orders, the Knights Hospitallers of St John of Jerusalem and the Templars, followed the Augustinian rule, and both were settled in London. The Knights Hospitallers were founded about 1092 by the merchants of Amalfi in Italy for the purpose of affording hospitality to pilgrims in the Holy Land. The hospital or Priory of St John was founded in 1100 by Jordan Brizet and his wife Muriel outside the northern wall of London, and the original village of Clerkenwell grew up around the buildings of the Knights. A few years after this, the Brethren of the Temple of Solomon at Jerusalem, or Knights of the Temple, came into being at the Holy City, and they settled first on the south side of Holborn near Southampton Buildings. They removed to Fleet Street, or the New Temple, in 1184, where, as Spencer terms it, quote, "they decayed through pride," end quote, and the order, after much persecution, was suppressed in England, as it had been in other countries, by command of the Pope. The house in Fleet Street was given in 1313 by Edward II to Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, at whose death in 1323 the property passed to the Knights of St John, who leased the new temple to the lawyers, still the occupants of the district. The Templars wore a long flowing white mantle with a red cross on the left breast. The Knights Hospitallers originally wore a black robe with a cross, but subsequently, when the order was reconstructed on the model of the Templars, they wore a red mantle with a white cross on the shoulder. After Palestine was lost, the original body passed 1. to Acre, 2. to Cyprus, 3. to Rhodes, and 4. to Malta. The Templars left their beautiful church, to continue for centuries one of the most interesting architectural relics of a past age. The buildings of the Knights Hospitallers at Clerkenwell passed through more vicissitudes, and when the religious houses were suppressed by Henry VIII, these were mostly destroyed. The gateway, which was completed in 1504 by Prior Docre, still stands, but no portion of the church or other building remains above ground. Friars. The enthusiasm which brought the great religious movement after the conquest and produced the numerous monastic institutions of the country had cooled by the beginning of the 13th century, when the remarkable evangelical revival instituted almost simultaneously by St. Dominic and St. Francis swept over Europe. The distinctive characteristics which at first marked them off from the monks were poverty and care for others. The monks lived apart from the world in order to attend first to their own souls, while the friars placed care for others first of all duties. They preached to and visited the masses. Hence, instead of living in retired spots, they settled in the heart of the cities. In their humility they called themselves brothers rather than fathers, but in course of time they fell far short of the ideals of their founders. Their property increased, and their houses grew to be as rich as those of the monks, and in consequence they became singularly unpopular. Mr. Trevelyan writes in his Age of Wycliffe that while the monks were despised by the reformer, the friars were hated. Black Friars. The Spaniard, St. Dominic, founded the order of preaching friars at the beginning of the 13th century. Their rule, which was chiefly that of St. Augustine, was approved of by Pope Innocent III in the Lateran Council, AD 1215, by word of mouth and by the bull of Pope Honorius, AD 1216. They were called Dominicans from their founder, preaching friars from their office to preach and convert heretics, and black friars from their garments. In France, they were known as Jacobins from having their first house in the Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris. This name gained a portentous meaning in the 18th century from the French revolutionists who met in the disused friary. At first the friars used the same habit as the Austin canons, but about the year 1219 they took another, viz., a white cassock with a white hood over it, and when they went abroad, a black cloak with a black hood over their white vestments. They came to England in 1221, and their first house was at Oxford. Shortly after this they came to London, settled in Holborn near Lincoln's Inn, where they remained for more than 50 years. In 1276 they removed to the neighbourhood of Baynard Castle, where they erected a magnificent house with the help of royal, clerical, and other noble benefactors, which has given a name to a London district that it still retains. The place is thus described by Stephens, the monastic historian. Quote, "The monastery enjoyed all the privileges and immunities that any religious house had, and having a very large extent of ground within its liberty, the same was shut up with 4 gates, and all the inhabitants within it were subject to none but the king, the superior of the monasteries, and justices of that precinct, so that neither the mayor nor the sheriffs, nor any other officers of the city of London, had the least jurisdiction or authority therein. All which liberties the inhabitants preserved some time after the suppression of the monastery." End quote. Thomas Lord Wake is said to have intended to bring Dominican nuns into England, and he had the king's license for this purpose, but he does not appear to have carried out his intention. The nuns of Dartford in Kent are supposed to have been of this order at one time. Grey Friars. The Italian St. Francis was the founder of this order, whose rule he drew up in 1209. It was approved of by Pope Innocent III in 1210, and by the Lateran Council in 1215. His followers were called Franciscans from their founder, Grey Friars from their clothing, and Minor Friars from their humility. 9 Grey Friars landed at Dover in the 8th year of Henry III, 1223 to 1224. 5 of them settled at Canterbury, and there founded the first house of the order in England. The remaining 4 established themselves in London, lodging for 15 days with the Dominicans in Holborn. These 4, we learn from a Cottonian manuscript, were 1. Richard Pugworth, an Englishman, priest and preacher. 2. Richard Senenef, English, clerk acolyte, a youth. 3. Henry Detruse, by nation a Lombard, lay brother. 4. Monarchitus, also a lay brother. These 4 men founded the great London house of Grey Friars. They removed to Cornhill, where they erected cells, made converts, and acquired the goodwill of the mayor and citizens. John Ewan, mercer, appropriated to the use of the friars a piece of ground within Newgate. Here a noble building was erected by the help of numerous distinguished persons, which contained a church, a chapter house, a dormitory, a refectory, an infirmary, etc. The district was long known as Grey Friars, and afterwards as Christ Church or Christ's Hospital. The habit of the friars was a loose garment of a grey colour reaching down to their ankles, with a cowl of the same, and a cloak over it when they went abroad. They girded themselves with cords and went barefoot. In connection with the Franciscans were the nuns of the Order of St. Clare, founded at Assisi by St. Clare about 1212. The nuns observed St. Francis's rule and wore the same coloured habit as the Franciscan friars. They were called Poor Clares and also Minoresses. About the year 1293, Blanche, Queen of Navarre, wife to Edward, Earl of Lancaster, Leicester, and Derby, founded a house for the Minoresses on the east side of the street leading from the Tower to Aldgate without the walls of the city. This street is still known as the Minories. There were only 3 other houses of this order in England, viz., at Waterbeach and Denny in Cambridgeshire, and Brissyard in Suffolk. Austin Friars. The history of the foundation of the Friars Eremites of the Order of St. Augustine has not been given with any fullness, and its origin is somewhat uncertain. They came to England from Italy about 1250, and a house in Broad Street Ward was founded by Humphrey Bohun, Earl of Hereford and Essex, in the year 1253. The habit of the Austin Friars was a white garment and scapulary when they were in the house, but in the choir and when they went abroad, they had over the former a sort of cowl and a large hood, both black. Round their waist they had a black leather girdle fastened with an ivory bone. Footnote: in connection with the history of the Austin Friars, the fact that the Church of the Friary still exists is one of great interest. At the dissolution, a large portion of the friary was given to Lord St. John, afterwards Marquis of Winchester and Lord Treasurer. The church was reserved by the king, and the nave still remains. End of footnote. White Friars. The origin of the Friars of the Blessed Virgin of Mount Carmel is not very clear. Their rule, which was chiefly that of St. Basil, is said to have been given to them by Albert, Patriarch of Jerusalem, about 1205, and to have been confirmed by Pope Honorius in 1224. They were driven out of Palestine by the Saracens about 1238, and they then sought refuge in Europe. They were brought into England by John Vassy and Richard Grey, and had their first houses at Hulme in Northumberland and Aylesford in Kent. At the latter place they held their first European charter, AD 1245. The London House of the Carmelites, or White Friars, was founded in 1241 by Sir Richard Grey on land situated between Fleet Street and the Thames, which was given by Edward I. The garments of the friars at first were white, but having been obliged by the infidels to change them to party-coloured ones, they continued these for 50 years after their coming to England. But about the year 1290 they returned to the use of white again. Footnote: Dugdale says that the Patriarch Albert prescribed for the Carmelite friars a party-coloured mantle of white and red, and that Pope Honorius III, disliking this, appointed in 1285 that it should be all white. End of footnote. Of the 4 chief orders of mendicant friars, the Carmelites ranked last, and in official processions had to give place to the Dominicans, Franciscans, and Austin friars. The district which originally contained the House of the White Friars continues still to be known by the old name. After the dissolution of the religious houses, the privileges of sanctuary were still allowed to the inhabitants, and in consequence the place, generally known as Alsatia, gained a most unenviable notoriety. Other places in London obtained an evil repute from the same cause, but Whitefriars was far beyond all others in disgraceful associations. It is known from old records that the bad repute of the district dates back to a period long before the suppression of the friary. From a close roll of the 20th Edward III, it appears that persons of ill repute had, for a considerable time, made their abode so close to the friary that the friars could not celebrate divine service in their church in consequence of the continual clamours and outcries by which the district was disturbed, and the mayor and aldermen of London were ordered, in the king's name, for the tranquillity of the prior and brethren, to remove the nuisance. Mr. Trevelyan writes, quote, 20 years before Wycliffe's attack was made, Fitzralph, Bishop of Armagh, had laid a famous indictment against the 4 orders before the Pope at Avignon. It made a great stir at the time, but came to nothing, for the friars were under the Pope's special protection. The bishop chiefly complained of their competition with his secular clergy in the matter of confession and absolution. End quote. Besides the 4 chief orders, several other orders of friars were settled in London. First in importance of these were the crutched friars, from the cross forming part of the staff carried by them, which was styled a crutch. This was afterwards given up, and a cross of red cloth was placed upon the breast of the gown. The order is said to have been instituted by Gerard, prior of St. Mary of Morella at Bologna, and confirmed in 1169 by Pope Alexander III, who brought them under St. Austin's rule. They came to England in 1244 and had their first house at Colchester. It was not until about 1298 that these friars came to London, and the house in the parish of St. Olave, Hart Street, was founded by Ralph Hosier and William Saburns. The memory of the friary is kept alive in the name of the street that marks its site. Other orders in London were the Friars of the Penance of Jesus Christ, or Di Sacco, and the Friars di Areno. The Friars of the Sack, according to Stowe, first settled in a house near Aldersgate, outside the gate. This was about the year 1257. When the Jews were banished from England by Edward I, these friars were given the synagogue on the south side of Lothbury at the north corner of the Old Jewry. The tenements which the prior and friars held in the street, quote, called Colchester Street, end quote, were in the parishes of St. Olave in the Jewry and of St. Margaret de Lothbury. The friars of the Order of St. Mary de Areno were settled at Westminster at a house near Charing Cross, given to them by Sir William de Arno, or Armand, 51 Henry III, and here the small house remained until the death of Hugh de Ebor, the last friar, 10 Edward II. Bishop Stubbs refers to a cemetery near St. Clement Danes, which once belonged to the Pied Friars, a small order of mendicants which had been suppressed in 1278. In the revised edition of Dugdale's Monasticon by Cayley, Ellis, and Bandinel, there is a notice of the house of the Fratres de Pica, or Pied Friars at Norwich, from Bloomfield's History of Norfolk, but no mention is made of any house in London. Tanner says that there is no mention of these friars in any public record, and Taylor, in his Index Monasticus, gives no new information concerning them. Blomfield says that the friars were called from their outward garment, which was black and white like a magpie. At Hounslow there was a house of Trinitarian or Maturine friars for the redemption of captives. The earliest record known of this priory is a charter dated 1296. Besides the religious houses, there were, during the Middle Ages, many hermitages over the country, and several of these were to be found in London. One was in Monkwell Street, Cripplegate, which was founded by the widow of Sir Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, who was killed in a tournament in 1324. This was Mary de Castillon, daughter of Guy, Count of St. Paul, third wife of the Earl and the foundress of Pembroke Hall, Cambridge, who established the hermitage for the good of the soul of her husband. London was so full of religious houses, both within and without the walls, that when the great dissolution took place in Henry VIII's reign, large portions of the town were left desolate. Doubtless the time had come for this great revolution, or, otherwise, even that king could never have carried it through. The popular feeling which held these great establishments in disfavour had gradually grown. Still, the number of those who were dependent upon the religious houses was very considerable, and great evils followed the dissolution. Multitudes were thrown out of their regular employment, and the poor who were dependent upon the alms bestowed upon them at the gates of the monasteries had to be considered and provided for in some other way. The difficulties of this position certainly formed one of the causes of the institution of the Poor Law in the reign of Henry's daughter Elizabeth. Most of the relics of the various religious houses which occupied so large a portion of London and its environs have been entirely swept away. In the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, many remains existed. There were then vestiges of St. Helen's Priory, and the old hall of the nunnery was not pulled down until 1799. Relics of Bermondsey Abbey were standing in 1807. The grand crypt, built soon after the foundation of the house of the Priory of St. John at Clerkenwell, which was added to and afterwards made to form an undercroft to the choir, is now one of the most interesting of the remains of medieval buildings in London. It is below the Church of St. John, Clerkenwell, and has been restored with loving care to much of its original beauty. Other portions of the old buildings of the Priory are to be seen in the cellars of some of the houses round about. The position of the old Charterhouse buildings can still be traced, although little of the old monastery exists, but the east and south walls of the chapel and washhouse court can be seen. The latter was built by the monks to accommodate the lay brothers who acted as servants to the convent. The walls of the monastic refectories surround the present brothers' library. Beneath this is the monks' cellar. The friaries situated within the walls of old London have left little but their names to tell the Londoner of today of their existence. Still, even here, something of the past remains. The Church of Austin Friars is left to us, and the position of the choir of the great Franciscan house of Greyfriars is marked by the present Christ Church, Newgate Street. Some traces of the buildings of the Whitefriars have also been found underground. Sanctuary. One of the privileges of the Middle Ages which continued on into comparatively modern times was that of sanctuary, and in its belated form this caused many gross scandals. There are numerous stories connected with the College of St. Martin's-le-Grand, which was under the jurisdiction of the Abbot of Westminster. One of these relates to Richard III and Lady Anne. When the Duke of Gloucester desired to marry Anne, the betrothed of the late Edward Prince of Wales, son of Henry VI, her brother-in-law Clarence objected and hid her away. Richard discovered her in London disguised as a kitchen maid and placed her in sanctuary at St. Martin's-le-Grand. In 1416 a man was sentenced to the pillory for slandering an alderman, but he escaped and found sanctuary at the monastery of St. Peter's, Westminster. Mr. G. M. Trevelyan, in his work on the Age of Wycliffe, gives a full account of the great scandal which occurred in 1378, when 2 prisoners escaped from the Tower and sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. The governor of the Tower, with his soldiers, entered the nave and attempted to drag one of the prisoners, who was attending Mass, out of sanctuary. He fled for his life, and his pursuers chased him twice round the choir. He was stabbed to death, and one of the attendants of the church, interfering to save him, was killed in the scuffle. Archbishop Sudbury excommunicated the governor of the Tower, Sir Alan Bouchel, and all his aiders and abettors. Richard II ordered the reading of the excommunication to be stopped and the church to be reconsecrated. The abbot refused to allow the place to be hallowed, and the services ceased for a while. There was now an open quarrel between church and state, which continued till the Parliament met at Gloucester in October, quote, when the whole question of sanctuary was brought up in all its issues. End quote. Mr. Trevelyan sums up the case in these words. Quote, in vain Wycliffe argued, in vain the Commons petitioned and the Lords hectored. From all the mountains of talk in the discussion at Gloucester, there came forth the most absurd legislative mouse in the shape of a statute passed at Westminster by the next Parliament in the spring of 1379. By this act, the fraudulent debtor taking sanctuary was to be summoned at the door of the church once a week for 31 days. If at the end of that time he refused to appear, judgment was to go against him by default, and his goods, even if they had been given away by collusion, might be seized by his creditors. This mild measure, which was scarcely an interference with the right of sanctuary itself, was accepted even by the staunchest adherents of the Church. End quote. If a felon succeeded in taking sanctuary in a church or other privileged place before capture, he was free from the clutches of the law for the space of 40 days. He was allowed to be supplied with food, but he was sufficiently guarded to prevent his escape. If he elected to abjure the realm, an oath was administered to him. There seem to have been special privileges of sanctuary in the city, for we learn that at the end of the 13th century it was ordered by the alderman that no robber, homicide, nor other fugitive in the churches should be watched. This ordinance was for the purpose of giving a fugitive a chance of escape out of sanctuary. In 1321, a royal pardon was granted to the city for neglecting to keep watch on those who had fled for sanctuary to the city churches. This was granted, however, on the distinct understanding that in future a watch was to be kept on such fugitives in the same manner as in other parts of the realm. In 1334, the mayor was roundly taken to task and made to do penance by the archbishop for allowing a felon to escape from the Church of All Hallows, Grace Church. The sanctuary men were marked by a badge representing cross keys. Education. Medieval London was well supplied with facilities for education. We know that there were many schools in various parts of the city, although we still require more definite information. The church supplied the public well with schools, although for a time these fell into decay, and then it was that lay schools came into existence. Bishop Stubbs writes, quote, over against the many grievances which modern thought has alleged against the unlearned ages which passed before the invention of printing, it ought to be set to the credit of medieval society that clerkship was never despised or made unnecessarily difficult of acquisition. The sneer of Walter Map, who declared that in his days the villains were attempting to educate their ignoble and degenerate offspring in the liberal arts, proves that even in the 12th century the way was open. Richard II rejected the proposition that the villains should be forbidden to send their children to the schools to learn clergy, and even at a time when the supply of labour ran so low that no man who was not worth 20 shillings a year in land or rent was allowed to apprentice his child to a craft, a full and liberal exception was made in favour of learning. Every man or woman, the words occur in the Petition and the Statute of Artificers passed in 1406, of what state or condition that he be, shall be free to set their son or daughter to take learning at any school that pleaseth them within the realm. End quote. Again, quote, schools were by no means uncommon things. There were schools in all cathedrals. Monasteries and colleges were everywhere, and wherever there was a monastery or a college, there was a school. Towards the close of the Middle Ages, notwithstanding many causes for depression, there was much vitality in the schools. End quote. The larger English abbeys about the country not only had schools within their own precincts, but others dependent upon them in the neighbouring towns. Fitzstephen, in his description of London as preserved in the city's Liber Customarum, particularizes the Church of St. Martin le Grand as one of the principal churches of London which had ancient and prerogative schools, the others being St. Paul's and Holy Trinity, Aldgate. In other texts of Fitzstephen's work, the names of the churches are not mentioned, and Stowe, overlooking the text in the city archives, gives the 3 schools as attached to St. Paul's, St. Peter's, Westminster, and St. Saviour's. Fitzstephen's patron, St. Thomas of Canterbury, received his early education at one of the London schools after leaving the school of the Canons Regular at Merton, and before proceeding to the university. In 1447, 4 parish priests, in a petition to Parliament, begged the Commons to consider the great number of grammar schools, quote, that sometime were in divers parts of the realm, beside those that were in London, and how few there be in these days. End quote. They asked leave to appoint schoolmasters in their parishes, to be removed at their discretion. King Henry VI granted the petition, but subjected the priests' discretion to the advice of the ordinary. During this king's reign, 9 grammar schools were opened in London alone. End of chapter 11. End of section 23.